So we got some big ones this go around. One of our big ones is the visual representation of log files. That's going to be a server tree page called VLFs.
So first off, VLFs are virtual log files, and all of your SQL Server log files, not your log backups, but your actual LDF files, are made up of smaller internal chunks called virtual log files, or VLFs. So what this tool does, it gives the option to be able to go in and see what the structure of those is and see which are in use and which are available. And then to give you some cool abilities to shrink or expand the file. So here's an example. Go ahead and, you want to talk about what's going on with this one, Mitchell?
Right. So this is just a really small database, just an adventure work. I don't have a whole lot of backups on there. There's not a whole lot of use getting on. So as you saw at the beginning, there were only 2 virtual log files, both are really small. So what SQL Server does is when you're doing your log backups, it creates these virtual log files where it stores the information and it sequentially rolls through them, puts them in use, and then once it's gone through every single one of them, it will go back to the beginning and start using them again. So when you're under a heavy transaction load in your SQL Server, sometimes that the log file can get really bloated with these VLFs. And so what this does is it allows you to easily go in and visualize how many VLFs you have. If your log file has gotten bloated over time, or you had a large transaction and the log file grew unexpectedly, you can go in here and see if you can trim off some of that size.
Yep. So some of the things that would cause that log file to bloat or grow out over time could be if you're in a full recovery model database, all of your transactions are stored in this LDF file until your transaction log backups run. And if something happens and your transaction log backups aren't running for a little while, the file can grow quite a bit, and then you need to come in and clean it up once in a while. The other thing is if there's something that's holding a transaction open for a really long time, really big transactions can cause it to bloat. And hopefully that's the kind of thing that if you see that happening, you can figure out what those big transactions are and clean it up a little bit. Do you have an example of one we can click on there, Mitchell, that has more VLFs showing?
Yeah, let me look in here. I don't have any personally.
I think on multi-SQL, SQL 2022, there's a bunch of databases there, but I think Bad VLFs is one of the test databases.
There we go.
And actually, yeah, there we go.
So we can see that this has a bunch of VLFs, and this is set up to grow percentage-wise, which is a configuration that you probably want to avoid. You can see that they're growing sequentially bigger and bigger. But we created this tool so that you can actually shrink your VLFs in Database Health Monitor. So you don't have to take a script and run it in SQL Server itself or in Management Studio itself. You can simply just choose the size that you want to shrink it down to. And this will auto-select the smallest size possible based on what is last in use. And you can simply just hit shrink file. It'll execute, and it'll cut the log file down to size.
So one of the things, generally it's a bad idea to be regularly shrinking your log files because then they have to grow out throughout the day or the week and over time. So one of the things that we'll do if we see that there's a log file with a lot of VLFs in it, and usually our threshold is around 250 to 300 or so. If there's thousands of them, thousands of tiny VLFs, one of the things we'd like to do is to shrink the log file down to the smallest that we possibly can, and then expand it back out to the larger size that's big enough to handle the typical log file needs. But we end up then with a lot of large chunks or large VLFs in the file instead of just a bunch of tiny ones. So if you expand that file, so what we'll do is oftentimes shrink it down as small as we can. And if the last file is in use, you might have to wait till tomorrow or until your next backups run, or wait till a later time in order to be able to shrink to a smaller part of the file. And then once we shrink it, we'll expand it back out to the size that it regularly needs to run. And there we go. So when you added 250, it added what looks like 6 or 8 log files there that were all similar sized, and instead of a bunch of little tiny log files like we had there previously.
So that was the overview of VLFs. Actually, one other thing is that if you don't want to use the shrink or expand inside Database Health, we also have the option that you can script based on your shrink and expand, and you can take this into SQL Server Management Studio and run it yourself.
Yep. And you know what's interesting on this is in the 3 or 4 week period from when you'd completed the code on this report until we actually had it deployed, I was probably on 3 or 4 different client calls where I wish I would have had that feature to work with them, where we had to go through and manually do it the old way, create scripts and manually go through and try and figure out what that log file looks like.
Right. We're hoping to get a whole lot of use out of this one going forward.